La la, la la. Great.
I'm very glad they were able to stay in for that. There is something about remembering together, and there's lots in the scriptures that talk about teaching your children and remembering together as a family, remembering back before children can remember, or even those who just weren't alive at the time. So I mentioned last week, I don't know if you recall, I mentioned our vanilla kitful days, the days that we have with our grandmother. Every year we would make our little crescent-shaped biscuits, and Grandma would be there watching over the children and the grandchildren, and now the great-grandchildren, and monitoring how they went, rolling out the dough, getting the icing sugar. And the key point was to roll them. You had to put your thumbs together. This is trade secrets, by the way. Maybe we should pause the stream. No, we'll leave it for now. Put your thumbs in, and you'd have to kind of turn the biscuit around into a crescent shape. And it couldn't be too thick, couldn't be too thin. It had to be smooth and uniform. And of course, you could never get one quite right until, of course, the day when Grandma criticised one, and it turned out that it was her own. And it was devastating to the whole process. We had that yesterday. We went down. Grandma she passed away, I couldn't tell you how many years ago now, but we still gather together. The quality has dropped, but they taste just as good, believe it or not. But we spent a lot of time, and I thought it was very appropriate to spend time sharing the stories. When we gather together, we bring together aunts and uncles and cousins who often don't get a chance to meet together as much as we grow up and families go different ways. And you spend time together remembering what Grandma used to do, remembering different events, recalling embarrassing stories about Grandpa or someone else, as long as Grandpa's still alive to be embarrassed by it, of course. And I've been spending a bit of time remembering and recalling more of some of the stories, some of the shaping stories of our family, the stories about how our family came to be where we are, when the grandparents kind of moved across from one country to another, points where they came to faith, times of great trial that perhaps solidified certain values, certain ways of doing family life, and spending time unpacking these. Of course, we know the ways that we live. We know, there's a particular way that us Boutrosses, we do birthdays, and a particular way we do Christmas and these kind of things. But you can do those things without knowing why we do them and how we came to that place. Sometimes as we remember the reflections that we have on the events that shape our life and who we are can be changed as well. They're not always static things, our memories and our remembrance of different things. And as life changes and new information comes to life and things shift, it can be terribly destabilizing to our identity if that's core to our identity. I remember my grandmother, the same grandmother. She grew up in Germany in the late 1920s and early 1930s, obviously moving into the wartime period. And she recalled often her life growing up in Germany at that time. And of course, she went along to the Hitler Youth and she was part of all their programs and things like that. And she talked about in class every day, they had their programs that they would go through. And you'd come and you'd sit down and you'd work through all the normal kind of stuff that you'd expect, your maths and English, well, not English, I got caught up there, but your maths and your German and your language skills and your social skills and things like that. And then they would have their report on the wall. And they'd have their big map up on the thing, and they'd have where their different troop movements were going and how wonderful it was, and about the sovereignty of the great Führer Hitler, who had it all in hand, and it was going to be wonderful, and it was this fantastic thing. And every week they'd rock up to class, and they'd sit in their little chairs, and they'd hear this every day that they rocked up, and they had and that was so completely her understanding of how the world worked, and it was such a cohesive picture, a structured, complete picture of the world. You know, she said it was like, the Hitler Youth was like scouts or something. You know, you didn't lie. You know, you obeyed your parents. You know, you were honest. You had to work hard. All these fantastic values she felt like she was instilled with growing up. And then I remember she recalled that as kind of time went on, each week they'd have their war updates, and she began to notice a pattern that every week it was, wonderful, this week we had successful retreat. And then the next day it was, we had successful retreat. And she said one time she put up her hand timidly, you know, not wanting to step out of line, and goes, if every week we're retreating, how are we going to win? And she was rebuked terribly. How dare you say this? This lack of faith. If the Führer says we're going to win, we are going to win. What are you talking about? And she got sent to the back of the classroom. And she says she remembers thinking, what do I know? I'm a kid. They know better than me. Foolish of me. And then she recounts, remembering hearing that they had one person on their street with a radio, and they'd heard about the crushing defeat, and the Russians were sweeping in through, and they were told that within a couple of days they were going to be entering their town, and it was all over, and they were coming in brutally, and they were killing a lot of the men, and they were doing all these things, and suddenly she had this realization that all that she'd learned, that had carefully and insistently built up about the world, about everything, about her value system, about all the grown-ups that she'd trusted and who had entrusted her with this picture of how things would go, all of that had come apart, was false. There was a hollowness, an emptiness, and there were clear lies that had obviously been part of it all. And it fell apart. She remembers scrambling through her room. They were trying to get rid of anything that they had that was anything to do with the Nazi party. And she said she was told that they had a couple of days. And she remembers she was pulling out all of her stuff. She had all of her school books laid out. She just pulled them all out, covered in red, black, and white, and swastikas. And at that moment, the Russians came in and stood over her while she's sitting there with all this stuff laid out, and the horror that everything had been swept away and lost. The memories and our experiences that we have and that we carry with us shape our perception of the world. They shape the way that we relate to other people. They shape the way that we understand ourselves and our community around us. We see the importance of this when we think about the terrible diseases that affect memory. Things like dementia, where people slowly lose their capacity to relate to the world around them and to perceive the world around them in the way that they previously had, and how challenging it is to maintain the same relationships that you had before. Now, I will say that as Christians, we have the relief of not having to believe, as some do, that our memory is who we are, that we only exist as far as our relative perception of reality, and if that is lost, then we are nothing. Our worth is deeper and goes beyond what we remember, what we recall, and what we understand. And even if we lose all of our memory, we do not lose our essential worth in God's eyes, and our fundamental capacity to be who we're called to be. But memory is a beautiful gift, the ability to engage with the world, with God, with others, to understand and to perceive. The Bible is full, as we mentioned before, the Bible is full of references to memory and a call to remember. I think in Deuteronomy alone, there's something like 15 or 16 different times where they're called to remember. The Israelites, that is. Deuteronomy 4, remember the day you stood before me. Assemble the people to hear my words so that they may learn to revere me as long as they live in the land and may teach these things to their children. Deuteronomy 5, remember when you were slaves in Egypt and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. When you face your enemies, do not be afraid, but remember well what the Lord did to Pharaoh when you were escaping from Egypt. Remember how you stuffed up and you were called to wander in the wilderness for all those years to reform your character. You wear tassels on your garments, that every day you see them, that you'll be reminded of my character. Make sure that you eat unleavened bread for the week, because that act will help you to remember that time when you had to leave Egypt in a rush. Remember the promises that were made to Moses, to Abraham. We are called, and the Israelites were consistently called, to an act of intentional remembrance as a foundation and to aid their capacity to continue to live as God's people. In order to live well, memory is considered critical. But more than this, the Lord remembers. And there's many passages about the Lord remembering or being called to remember. Noah's Ark, one of the classic stories. In the ark, boat, rain, I think most of us know a lot of the basics. But there they are, and the world is flooded. And the creatures die. All the creatures, that breathe air are dead. And there they are, floating on this tiny little boat for 150 days in Genesis 7. And then Genesis 8 starts off. But God remembered Noah and the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark. And he sent wind over the earth, and the waters receded. Later, God remembered Rachel, and he listened to her and allowed her to conceive. In Exodus, I heard the groanings of the Israelites whom the Egyptians are enslaving, and I have remembered the covenant that I had with them. When the Israelites are out there with Moses, and Moses is nicked off, and they're just not sure anymore, and they've kind of already forgotten who God is and what he does to them. They decide, well, no stress, we can fill this gap with a nifty little golden cow, which I'm sure could probably fill what we need right now. And so they build this cow, and they bring destruction down upon themselves. And Moses comes down, and what does he say? He says, turn from your fierce anger, relent, and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember your servants, Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. Remember your servants, Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, whom you swore by your own self, I will make descendants of them as numerous as the stars in the sky. Samson, you remember Samson with the long hair? Not very good for church, is it? Long hair, and he's stuffed it up. He's had his hair cut, and he's there, and he's strapped up, and the Philistines have gouged out his eyes, and he's done. And he gives this prayer. He says, Lord, remember me, and just give me one more shot to do this. Give me my strength back. And he pulls down the temple. Chronicles, Lord God, do not reject your anointed one. Remember the great love promised to David, your servant. As I mentioned in communion, all of these are invoking the character of God, and all of them are expecting response. It is a call to action. It is a call to for the Lord to act in accordance with who he is. It is a relational thing, but by its very essence, it is calling for action in response. But as we've said, and as we've looked at already, memory and remembering themselves are not perfect. We are not great at remembering in and of ourselves. I don't think, as I look around, I need to suggest to people that sometimes our memories fail and we forget things. And we think about the mundane things. We think about remembering as a passive thing. People's names that slip through the cracks, where you put your keys. Not picking up the kids from school, obviously, I'd always remember that. But there's lots of things that can slip through, important and not important, that we can forget, that can slip from our memory. There's that classic old story of Einstein. He's taking this train through Europe. I'm sure we've all heard this story. And the conductor's coming through, stamping all the different tickets. And he gets up to Einstein. And Einstein is looking around. He checks his pocket. He checks his other pocket. He's like, I can't find my ticket. And he's searching, and the conductor goes, don't worry, I know who you are. We all know who you are. You're a man of character and integrity. You don't need to stress about it. And on he goes. He's checking his pocket. He opens his bag. He's opening the side pockets, the other pockets. He's going. He's looking increasingly flustered. And he goes, Mr. Einstein, seriously, don't worry about it. Forget about it. I know who you are. If you'd like, I'll pay for another ticket for you. Don't worry about it. And eventually, Einstein's tipping his stuff out of his bag, and he goes, I appreciate it. I'm very grateful for that, but I can't remember what station I'm supposed to get off on. We're all susceptible to gaps in our memory. But it's not just that, is it? Our memory is also shaped by our experience, our emotions, our incomplete knowledge, the transition as you become, for example, an adult, and when you become a grown-up, and when you hit different milestones, and suddenly it sheds new light on a lot of things that your parents did, and you begin to think, that's why they got annoyed whenever I did that. That's terribly annoying, and you suddenly realize, or when your kid suddenly runs out towards the road and you feel this feeling, the first time you feel it, this horrible feeling where your whole body seems to kind of go inside out, and the throbbing adrenaline through your body, and your response isn't, that's okay, you're safe now, it's all right. It's often, what the heck are you doing? It's completely new. And then you think back and you think, whoa, I really did. I yelled at them. They didn't know what was happening. That was all right. And you think, yeah, I remember those times that my parents seemed so unfair and so angry when stuff had gone wrong. I kind of understand that now, whether or not that excuses it. We get new understanding, new insight sometimes that changes how we perceive things from the past. I remember being at a workplace for years and years, and it being a tough time, especially around this particular person, because I just always used to stuff things up. I just wasn't good at my job there in that particular space. And then years later, in conversations and working over that, realizing, actually, I was pretty good at my job. That person was a really horrible person, but I couldn't see that when I was in that space. I didn't have the confidence and the awareness to understand that. Even the memories that we've got safe and locked up and preserved, memories that can be really critical for informing the decisions that we make, can betray us, can be wrong, can lead us down a dark path. Even the act of memory can be an act of sin and destructiveness, or healing and wholeness, depending on how we reflect on it and how we engage with it. We spent a fair bit of time a couple of weeks ago looking at forgiveness, the critical importance of forgiveness. Speaking of remembrance, the kids are doing the Lord's Prayer at the moment. They're going over that each week to remember it. Memorizing Bible verses just seems to do something more than just lock it away as an information thing. There's something about having the words there that it seems like sometimes it's easier for the Spirit of God to bring them to mind. It's a fantastic thing to do. But following on from the Lord's Prayer, forgive us, Lord, as we forgive those who sin against us. Jesus then doubles down. He says, for if you do not forgive, you will not be forgiven with the same measure. Forgiveness is critically important. But forgiveness is an act of intentionally changing the way that we engage with a memory of something that happened. There is a giving up, a handing over of something to God in that. Now, there's verses that talk about God, no longer remembering our sins and things like that. We don't forget when we have been sinned against, and that's not, I believe, what we're called to do. But when we remember those things, we do not hold on to them ourselves, but we give them to God, and God takes the bitterness out of them. He leads us to a place of forgiveness. And that changing of how we understand the things that have happened to us, the pain that's been done against us, that removal of we are deficient because of what someone has taken away from us, and the replacing of that with, it is God who makes us whole, is a transformative shift to the way that we remember. It was a while after that, and Grandma had been through some terrible things in East Germany when the Russians took over as a young woman. There's lots of stories, incredible stories of miraculous interventions and drunk Russian guards suddenly looking up and in horror and fleeing, and Grandma being saved from all sorts of situations. But one of her maybe less incredible stories that she told far more often was the follow-up to that original story when her world fell apart, when the stack of understandings and memories and her remembrance of what it was to be German and to be in the world fell apart, was as she was working through that. She remembered pacing around her room one day and reflecting on this fact that everyone had lied to her, that everyone who'd been trustworthy had sold her out, had given her something shallow and hollow to hold on to. And she remembered walking over to the window and reflecting on all that she learnt about God. Her parents had been Catholic, and they'd had a terrible priest, and he'd given it up. But she says she remembered this process of saying, well, they lied about everything else. They also said that God was fairy tales. There was no such thing as, that Jesus and all these things, that was all rubbish, that Christianity was hokey and false. If they lied about all the rest of it, maybe that's true. And she said she knelt down by her bed and she said, God, if you are real, then let me know. And she said straight away, this old, slightly eccentric couple from down the road just popped into her mind. And she felt like she had to go and talk to them. She said they just kind of kept out of stuff. They were never involved with politics. They just kind of kept to themselves. So she said she went down, and she would have been maybe 16 or so at the time, maybe 17, or not quite an adult. She headed down and went down to this couple, and she knocked on the door, and she said they opened the door, and before she said anything, they said, we've been expecting you, we've been praying for you for many years. And she went and she said, all I need to know is, all this stuff about God and Jesus, is it real? And they said, yes, it is real. And she said that moment, that pivotal moment of everything being swept away, that entire lifetime of memories and understanding that had been shattered, it didn't disappear, but God took that and used that and transformed and redeemed that into a new understanding and a new understanding of who God was in the world and what her purpose was. And her new understanding changed everything. In a week where we spend time remembering, what I might do is, I might spend some time in prayer. What I'd like to do is to give us some space to offer our hearts and our memory up to God. And then I might pray for us all together and our week, and in particular for Remembrance Day, and then for us as a church and how we remember ourselves. Would that be all right? But I might do that and share with you in a time of prayer. But I'd like to start off by opening up with some space for us to perhaps open up our hearts to the Spirit of God, who is willing and able and knows us, to open our memories and our hearts and our experiences up to God, to let Him perhaps speak to us if there's something that he wants to address or speak to in our history, in our past, in our story that shapes who we are, how we understand the world, and how we understand God. For there is no pain, suffering, or sin present now, nor in the future, nor even in the far reaches of our past, that God does not want to lay his healing hand upon and bring to wholeness and redemption. So I'd like to spend a bit of time on that now,